all this success could not be made possible without the support and assistance from Dean Bob Frank, who is the College Dean of Arts and Science, and he will introduce today's honorable speaker.
Thank you. It's hard for me to believe that we have all that programming underway when it feels like we just launched this whole effort about a week ago. So very, very impressive. It's my, if I don't lose your thought here again, it's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker for the kickoff here of the fall version of the Wealth and Poverty Week. Ted Strickland grew up in a large family in Appalachian, Ohio. He was the first in his family to go to college and earned a Master of Divinity degree at Ashbury Theological Seminary. I think my oldest son was married there, actually, outside Louisville, right?
Lexington.
Oh, Lexington.
Outside Lexington.
Yeah, maybe it's a different place. And a doctoral degree in counseling psychology from the University of Kentucky followed. He looks like a real liberal arts graduate to me because he's been an ordained Methodist minister, a psychologist, a university professor, and then, of course, in 1992, he went to Congress and represented counties that stretched from Cincinnati to Youngstown for 12 years. In 2006, he had a successful run and became governor of the state of Ohio. He was taking office right in, if you remember that time, I certainly do, it was a very challenging time in the history of our country as we were teetering on a real economic disaster. And he dealt with the crisis by making strategic investments in education, renewable energy, and important infrastructure. After losing a bid for re-election in 2010, he was a fellow at the Institute for Politics at Harvard University. He served as an alternate delegate to the 68th United Nations General Assembly and participated as a member of the Governor's Council at the Bipartisan Policy Center. He also worked for 1 year as president of the Center of American Progress Action Fund. Now he's finally here. Today he's been visiting campus. I hope you've had a chance, some of you, to interact with him. Got such an interesting life and wealth of experience to share with us. So we're very pleased to have him here during this last semester with us on campus. And I look forward to the talk he's going to give today entitled Restoring the American Dream and Securing a Stable American Democratic Society. I give you Governor Ted Strickland.
Thank you, Dean. Thank you. Well, thank you very much for taking part of your day and spending it with me. Let me say that during my short time in being in residence here at Ohio University, and by the way, Dean, I like to call it Ohio's University. It's been a wonderful experience. And to the professors who've invited me into their classrooms and to the students who've listened to my stories and opinions, thank you. I appreciate that. And Dean Frank, I'm very grateful to you for the opportunity you've given me to be here. This campus just gives you a feeling of community. There's an energy and a sense of community here that I feel and appreciate very much. One of the reasons I'm such a cheerleader for Ohio University is because it's a diverse place. It's a place where ideas are important and dreams are pursued. As Ohio's oldest university, I think I'm correct? As Ohio's oldest university, you have rich traditions and a proud history. You've welcomed presidents and international leaders to talk about world and national issues and to suggest solutions to some of mankind's most vexing problems. It's a place where young people come from all over the country and from throughout the world. And they find here a community where they can study, learn, and expand their understandings of themselves and of the world. Being in Appalachia and located in Ohio's poorest community, it's a place where many first-generation students find opportunities that were unavailable to their parents. Now, when Dean Frank invited me to come and spend some time on this beautiful campus, I was unsure what I could contribute that would be meaningful to students. But when I was told about the wealth and poverty theme, I said, that's it. I don't have much wealth, but I know a lot about poverty. I grew up in a large Appalachian family not far from Athens. During my younger years, we lived on a dirt road, and I remember the old oil truck driving down the road in the summertime, spreading used oil on the dust to hold the dust down. Can you imagine such a thing being allowed today? I was one of 9 kids. We were kind of poor, but so was everyone else that I knew. We had an outhouse. During the question and answer session, if someone wants to ask me what that is, I'll be happy to answer. But we had an outhouse, and we got our water from a well. We went barefoot in the summer because we saved our shoes for school. We had a big garden, and we had pigs and chickens and cows and horses. When I was in high school, I milked a cow each morning and evening. It's sort of like riding a bike. Once you learn how to do it, you never forget. We always had plenty of milk in our house. No one that I knew went to college. And throughout my high school years, I just never knew or expected to be a college student. But you know, with the encouragement of my teachers and my parents, and the support especially of my mom, dad, brothers, and sisters, I became the very first person in my family to earn a college degree. Now, how did that happen? Well, let me share with you a little history. In 1933, Franklin Delano Roosevelt became president, and he immediately went to work. He instituted multiple economic programs to stimulate the economy and to pull our country out of the Great Depression. Those programs and the war economy that followed enabled my dad to get a good union job in the steel mill and place our family on a more secure economic footing. So by the time that I was born in 1941, a long time ago, and being the youngest son, I had opportunities that my siblings never had. Living in the country, I had little exposure to a world that was more than a few miles from my home. I attended a one-room country school until the 5th grade. There was 1 teacher, 27 students. I lacked self-confidence. I had a severe stuttering problem. But you know, my mom and my teachers never gave up on me. I was a popular kid in high school, but my high school academic record was mediocre at best. So how did a kid with a background like mine end up in the governor's office? Trust me, it wasn't because I possessed unusual abilities or attributes. It was because the economy at the time of my coming of age enabled me and other kids from working class families to get an education that was affordable. In 1959, I started Asbury College, a small Christian liberal arts institution located near Lexington, Kentucky. My tuition for 1 quarter at Asbury was $300, including housing and food. $900 for an entire year. It's a sad reality that 59 years ago, I had an opportunity to pursue my American dream, while today many young people from poor and working class families are finding it nearly impossible to pursue theirs. And that's what I want to talk with you about this afternoon, the American dream. You know, I've asked several people since I've been on campus what the American dream means to them. Almost everyone says something like this: the American dream means that if you're willing to work hard, you have an opportunity to get a good education, have a good job, have good health care, buy a nice home, and live a middle-class life, believing that your children can do even better. Now, to a large degree, the history of American economic policy making is the story of the waxing and the waning of this middle-class ideal. Although there is no record that Abraham Lincoln himself ever used the phrase, the American dream, it has historically been associated with him because of his policies. According to Lincoln, government was morally obligated to provide economic opportunity for people, especially the poor. He stood for positive government intervention in the economy, and he promoted economic development and job creation through public works projects. He promoted the American dream without ever using the words. Beginning with Lincoln's vision and continuing to the present time, there's been an ongoing struggle over which of two competing theories should control economic policy in America. In fact, the historical debate about what fiscal policies create the highest levels of economic growth, benefiting the largest number of people, has not substantially changed in the last 150 years. On the one side of the debate are those who support a supply-side approach to the economy, based upon the belief that maximum levels of economic growth can be achieved by having a regressive tax structure to benefit the wealthy and provide business with investment capital needed for job creation. Put succinctly, supply-side theorists see production or supply rather than demand as the main engine of U.S. economic growth. On the other side of the argument are those who advocate a demand-side approach to the economy, emphasizing a progressive tax structure that adequately funds government and enables workers to have the resources needed to become consumers. Robust consumerism, they believe, leads to increased production and an expanding economy where everyone benefits and the middle class grows. Now, there have been periods in our history when one or the other of these theories was dominant, and the results were dramatically different for average citizens. The supply-side approach stresses getting rid of government regulations and views government intervention in the economy as a violation of freedom. This thinking was dominant during the so-called Gilded Age and was reflected in The Gospel of Wealth, a book written by Andrew Carnegie. He was the steel magnate who was one of the most influential men of his time. Carnegie's Gospel of Wealth smacked of social Darwinism with its survival of the fittest economy, or philosophy, content to have a society divided between the winners and the losers with little concern for the losers. The father of social Darwinism was Herbert Spencer, an Englishman who believed that all of life, including social, economic, and political life, was governed by a universal law of adaptation. His books became very popular among the elites of the time and provided justification for the horrendous poverty and extreme wealth inequality that existed. The following excerpt from one of his books presents an example of his philosophy. He wrote, and I quote, "The poverty of the incapable, the distresses that come upon the imprudent, the starvation of the idle, and the pushing aside of the weak by the strong are the decrees of a large, far-seeing benevolence. It seems hard that a laborer incapacitated by sickness should have to bear the resulting privations. It seems hard that widows and orphans should be left to struggle for life or death. Nevertheless, these harsh fatalities are seen to be full of the highest beneficence, the same beneficence which brings to early graves the children of diseased parents." Such thinking represents a dark period of our nation's social and economic history. But thankfully, it was never fully embraced in America. Nevertheless, for an extended period of time, Spencer's philosophy influenced the thinking of many of our country's most prominent business leaders. In fact, the gospel of wealth dominated both the Republican and the Democratic parties during the latter part of the 19th century. It resurfaced again in the 1920s and was pursued by Presidents Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover. But under the presidencies of Theodore Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, and FDR, reforms consistent with a demand-side approach to the economy were put in place. All three of these presidents returned to the ideals first articulated by Lincoln. Franklin Roosevelt, in fact, went so far as to propose a second Bill of Rights, under which a new basis of security and prosperity could be established for all. For all, he said, regardless of station, race, or creed. He included in those rights, 1, the right to a useful and remunerative job in the industries or shops or farms or mines of the nation. 2, the right to earn enough to provide adequate food and clothing and recreation. 3, the right of every family to a decent home. And 4, the right to adequate protection from the economic fears of old age, sickness, accident, and unemployment. In this Bill of Rights, President Franklin Roosevelt was expressing his version of the American dream, and he espoused an activist government coupled with a demand-side approach to the economy as the way to achieve it. FDR came to the presidency believing, unlike the supply-side theorists and the robber barons of the Gilded Age, that government could and should be an instrument of change. The country was floundering. The Depression seemed intractable, and people were suffering. In response, Roosevelt worked to quickly enact major pieces of legislation that forever changed our government's relationship with the people. Among the most significant and enduring were the Works Progress Administration, the Civilian Conservation Corps, the Security and Exchange Commission, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, the Fair Housing Administration, the Fair Labor Standards Act, the National Labor Relations Act, and, of course, the Social Security Act, and the GI Bill of Rights. Now, this explosion of new programs, government expenditures, and regulations on business was a dramatic departure from supply-side economics. The fact is, Roosevelt had written a new social contract with the American people, and he gave millions the opportunity to pursue their American dream. As I was growing up in the 40s and 50s, it was common for my family to sit around a table and talk about politics. As a young person, I heard about the 1929 stock market crash and the hardships caused by the deep depression that followed. I heard that Roosevelt changed things. I heard stories about the violent labor strikes of the 1930s and how Roosevelt protected workers' rights to organize and bargain for things like a minimum wage, a 40-hour work week, and an end to child labor. These stories shaped my thinking and gave me an awareness that government could do good and could help people. That belief was strengthened when my junior class went to Washington, D.C. for a visit. Visiting the historical buildings and the monuments affected me in a very powerful way. I was there with my student friends, and we went to the National Archives, and I remember seeing the original copy of the Declaration of Independence. I felt a deep pride in my country, and I wanted to be involved in efforts to make it better. And I've never lost that feeling. I believe now, as Roosevelt did in his time, that laws should be passed, regulations should be imposed, and the instruments of government should be used to create a fair and just society where all people have a chance. A society where those in need receive help, where the middle class grows, and where average people can achieve the American dream. I think that's why I eventually ran for the Congress. Now, it's true that not all the presidents that followed FDR were enamored by the idea of an activist government and a demand-side economy. Yet they made no concerted effort to dismantle the legacy of these New Deal programs. In fact, Eisenhower had his own activist government agenda. He pushed for the creation of the interstate highway system. Can we imagine America today without the interstate highway system? And following the Soviet Union's launching of Sputnik, Eisenhower supported federal aid to education. The Kennedy-Johnson era was a heady time for those of us who believed that government had the ability and responsibility to take care of the poorest of our citizens. There was a massive expansion of government with the passage of new federal programs. And those programs included the Economic Opportunity Act to wage the war on poverty, the Appalachian Regional Development Act to fight poverty in Appalachia, the Higher Education Act, and Medicare and Medicaid. These Great Society programs, as they were called, represented the greatest increase in government program spending since the New Deal. In fact, I believe that President Johnson came to this very campus to promote his Great Society vision for America. But paying for these programs, as good and effective as they were, while also paying the additional costs for the war in Vietnam, eventually led to budget deficits and inflationary pressures that dogged our economy for the next decade. The resulting stagflation, high unemployment and high inflation during the Carter presidency likely resulted in Carter's defeat in his bid to be reelected. Now, with the election of Ronald Reagan to the presidency in 1980, support for an active, expansive government, progressive taxation, and regulations to control business excesses came to an abrupt halt. Reagan was a true supply-side enthusiast, and once in office, he declared that government is not the solution. Government is the problem. He immediately cut the marginal tax rate from 70% to 50%, and then eventually to 28% by the time he left office 8 years later. At the time Reagan came to office, I had just lost my third attempt to be elected to the House of Representatives. And I remember traveling to Washington in a vain attempt to persuade Ohio's legislators to oppose Reagan's tax cuts and economic agenda, an agenda that the first Bush president had previously called voodoo economics. Reagan, like other supply-siders, believed that cutting taxes on the wealthy would result in a trickle-down effect. The economy would grow and everyone would benefit. In his economic message to Congress in early 1981, Reagan spoke out strongly against the demand-side approach to fiscal policy, saying, "The taxing power of government must be used to provide revenues for legitimate government purposes. It must not be used to regulate the economy or to bring about social change." Although there was economic growth under Reagan, and he was successful in bringing inflation under control, his policies disproportionately benefited the wealthy and significantly increased the national debt. During the presidential campaign of 1988, George Herbert Walker Bush had said to the people, "Read my lips, no new taxes." But after assuming the presidency, economic conditions really forced him to renege on that promise, and he raised taxes to his political detriment. The marginal tax rate went up, and he never recovered from having broken his pledge. The result, he became a one-term president. In 1992, the nation was ready for change. Bill Clinton became president and returned the country to a more demand-side fiscal policy. He raised the marginal tax rate for the highest income taxpayers to 40%, and he made critical investments in education, job training programs, research, and other initiatives. And the economy caught fire. From 1993 through 2000, 23 million new jobs were created, more than 2.9 million jobs per year. And by the end of Clinton's second term, he had achieved a balanced budget and began paying down the national debt. The success of the Clinton agenda posed a direct challenge to the supply-siders' claim that growth comes from cuts in the top marginal tax rate. The first Clinton social initiative to become law was the Family and Medical Leave Act of 1993. This law strengthened families and enabled more women to fully participate in the workforce. I was in the House of Representatives and serving on the Education and Labor Committee at the time. My committee had jurisdiction over the bill, and I was proud to have a part in its passage. Even now, when I'm at a place of business and I look up on the bulletin board and I see the notice of employee rights to this workplace guarantee, I feel good knowing that government can do things which help ordinary people to have a better and a more secure life. Now, with the election of George W. Bush in 2001, we saw a dramatic reversal in fiscal policy. Bush was a supply-side tax cutter. He pushed through major cuts in the income tax, the estate tax, corporate taxes, and taxes on capital gains. His plans shifted from a progressive tax on income to a more regressive tax on consumption. The result? A return of federal budget deficits and growing income and wealth equality. Obama entered the presidency in January of 2009, just as the dean noted earlier, just as the nation teetered on the edge of an economic Armageddon. When Lehman Brothers, the fourth largest investment bank in America, filed for bankruptcy on September the 15th, 2008, it sent shockwaves throughout the economy, causing paralyzing fear that things were spinning out of control. Recognizing the seriousness of the situation, Obama took decisive action to stabilize the economy and prevent the nation from slipping into a second Great Depression, not unlike what had happened in 1929. He rescued the auto industry, which was on the path to bankruptcy. He passed a large stimulus package designed to create jobs. And he used the bully pulpit to reassure the country that we would survive and recover. I have vivid memories of that critical time. Prior to his inauguration, Obama invited all of the nation's governors to meet with him in Philadelphia to discuss the gravity of the situation and to seek consensus about what needed to be done. In that meeting, I shared with the President and my fellow governors the budget crisis we were facing in Ohio, and I pleaded with him to make assistance to state governments a part of the stimulus package being considered. Thankfully, he listened. The help that Ohio was provided enabled us to fund education and other vital state services, to create jobs and improve our state's infrastructure. The Nelsonville bypass is one concrete result of the resources that came to Ohio through that stimulus package. Now, the good news is that with the help of the federal government, we got through the recession without sliding into a total depression. The bad news is many Americans suffered unimaginable loss and hardship and have never fully recovered. For many, recovery will be increasingly difficult due to globalization and technological advances. Productivity has increased, while technology has led to heavy job loss in many industries, making the government's role in protecting the middle class and the poor more important than ever. Without a doubt, there is still important work that needs to be done. Children to be educated, older citizens to be cared for, an environment to protect, and community improvements to be made. However, the issue is not only the need for jobs, we also need regulations and tax policies that protect workers and guarantee good wages, policies that lead to shared prosperity. Senator Elizabeth Warren, writing in her book, "This Fight is Our Fight," points out that although the economy grew from 1980 to 2015, 90% of America, everyone outside the top 10%, got almost nothing, not even 1%. Since 1980, nearly 100% of the growth in market income, and that's income that individuals earn before taxes and government transfers like Social Security, has been gobbled up by the top 10%. Or to put it more simply, the 10% got just about everything, and the 90% got essentially nothing. So let's fast forward and focus on the here and now. There's a raging debate underway in Washington regarding tax reform. One thing is certain: the supply side versus demand side struggle for supremacy is central to that debate. And the outcome of that struggle will have a profound effect on our nation's economy for years to come. President Trump says he wants a middle-class tax cut. But an analysis of what is known about the current proposal, and it's just a proposal at this point, indicates that 80% of the tax cuts could go to the richest 1% of Americans. That, my friends, is supply-side economics on steroids. The rich and powerful will keep more money, and the opportunities for everyone else will diminish. So I'd like to pose a question to you this afternoon. How much poverty and wealth disparity can we have in this country before the foundations of our democracy begin to crumble? I don't know where the tipping point is, but I'm convinced that as responsible citizens, it is a question we must ask ourselves. I've shared with you this afternoon my thoughts about two competing economic theories. Norton Garfinkel writes in his book, The American Dream versus the Gospel of Wealth, that every economic policy has three kinds of consequences: factual, moral, and political, leading to three questions. Does it work? Is it fair? Will it sustain democratic structures of our society? In my judgment, this is my personal opinion, and I have the podium, so I'm sharing my personal opinion. And I'll be happy to hear differing opinions when I've stopped talking. But in my judgment, history and experience has shown us that supply-side economics doesn't work. Its historical effects have been destructive, I believe, to the middle class. It doesn't work, it isn't fair, and over time, it contributes to high levels of wealth disparity, which has a corroding effect on our democracy. We are stronger, I believe, and our democracy is more stable when the wealth of our nation is shared with the people and everyone has both the freedom and the opportunity to pursue their American dream. In 1976, Hubert Humphrey, United States Senator and former Democratic presidential candidate, gave his last speech on the floor of the Senate. He was fighting cancer at the time, and it was evident that he was near the end of his life. Those of us who knew Senator Humphrey remember him as a man who always worked to help those who were poor and marginalized. So it was no surprise to us that in his final message to the Senate, he appealed to the collective conscience of the nation. He said, "The moral test of government is how that government treats those who are in the dawn of life, the children, those who are in the twilight of life, the elderly, and those in the shadows of life, the sick, the needy, and the handicapped." So during this Wealth and Poverty Week, perhaps we should all think deeply about how we as individuals can best respond to the challenge of his words. Because as Garfinkel tells us, economics in America has always been about more than managing the national household. It has always been about more than dollars and cents. It has been about defining who we are and what kind of nation we seek to be. Thank you. Am I supposed to turn this over to you?
Any questions or comments, or he should run for the next president, or anything?
Yes.
In the past few years, we've seen unprecedented technological growth in robotics and artificial intelligence. Many experts predict upcoming waves of automation that may put millions of American truckers, laborers, and white-collar workers out of work through no fault of their own. Are there any particular policies or actions that the government can make so that our technological growth can improve the lives of all Americans and not just our largest corporations?
Did everyone hear the question? It was a great question. Would you mind standing up? Come up here beside me. Right up here beside me. It was a great question. I'm not sure I have the total answer, but share that question with everyone.
Okay, in the past few years, we've seen unprecedented technological growth in robotics and artificial intelligence. Many experts predict that there are going to be upcoming waves of automation that may put millions of American truckers, laborers, and white-collar workers out of work through no fault of their own. Is there any particular policy or action that the government can do to make sure that our technological growth improves the lives of all Americans and not just our largest corporations?
And if I had the answer to that question, I would run for president. But thank you for that question. It's a great question. And there's a lot of discussion about whether or not automation technology is going to eliminate the need for people. And there has even been discussion among some of my more progressive friends that we need to be thinking about a guaranteed annual income. Now, we're a long way from that today, but I do think it's worth considering. Will we reach a point in this country where there are not enough jobs for the people who need to work as a result of technology and automation? Now, others will say, well, with every new technological advance, there are new jobs created. And so we are not going to run out of jobs. I guess the answer that the first answer that I would have for your question is this. There's a lot of work that needs to be done we aren't doing. Children need to be cared for. As I said, older people need to be cared for. We need community improvements. So I think as a government we ought to be thinking about not replicating what FDR did with WPA, the Works Progress Administration, but perhaps a new version of that, so that everyone who wants to work has a job and every job pays a living wage. That ought to be our goal. And we're a long way from there, but my personal feeling is that government does have a responsibility to consider programs which protect people from having to work really hard and still live in poverty. And the latter part of your question, we just read just the last sentence or two of your question.
About millions of American truckers, laborers.
Even after that.
Is there anything in particular that the government can do to ensure that our technological growth improves the lives of all Americans and not just our largest corporations?
And there I think that last part, all Americans inclusively and not just the largest corporations, sort of gets to what I was trying to say in my long speech. We need policies that make sure that the wealth of the country is a shared wealth. And what we are seeing in America today is the greatest gap between the richest among us and everyone else that we have seen since before the Great Recession, or the Great Depression of 1929. And I think that is due in part to governmental policies. And so that does speak to your question. I think the government could pursue policies that 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 decreased the wealth disparity. I mean, the top marginal tax rate used to be over 80%, and it's a lot lower than that now, which means that the larger number of just average people are carrying a larger share of the burden compared to what it was, say, in the 1950s. Thank you for the question. Are there any other questions, comments, contradictions? Argue with me. Tell me I'm wrong.
Why does the supply side theory seem to persist? You know, based on your experience in government, it seems to me, and I'm not an expert on that, but just from what I've been reading, it doesn't work. And so why do people tend to vote against their common interest? Why is this, I'll use the word myth, accepted?
I'm not sure, but it's tenacious. Some people really won't let go of it, and I believe, I mean, listen, if you've got a different point of view, I respect that, and feel free to express it to me and to everyone else here. But from my point of view, if we look at history, it really hasn't had the result. Now we're having this issue now about this tax cut, and the idea is, I mean, they're saying people who are promoting the tax cut that is likely to be considered are saying it's going to result in $4,000 increase in wages. That's assuming that the corporate decision makers will choose to use whatever benefit they get out of this tax proposal to increase wages for their workers. And I don't see any evidence that that's happened historically. They'll use it for stock buybacks and for dividends and so on and so forth. Not likely to just willingly share it with the workers in the form of increased wages. And that's one of the big problems that we see in America today, is that people are working hard and wages have remained, I mean, they're starting to show some modest increase, but wages have remained relatively flat. While wealth has occurred, productivity's gone up, wealth has been created. There was a time when if a person worked hard and increased productivity, that wages went up in a corresponding manner. And sometime around the early 70s, there was a divergence there, and productivity continued to go up, wealth continued to be created, but the wages flattened out. And I think that's a very serious problem. And I don't have an answer to your problem, except these are two theories. They've been around a long time, and the proponents of each one seems to be determined that their approach is the best approach. And we're going to see this battle play out in Washington over the next few weeks as this tax proposal is under consideration. Yes?
Well, it seems to me that it's also who controls the message, and that people are given a message that they listen to that is couched in a way that appeals to them and gets them almost to work against their better interest. I was talking with my son-in-law, who is a union man and lays block, and his job was pretty good in West Virginia for quite some time. And they passed a right-to-work law because they were envious of what was happening in the southern states where there weren't unions. And so who controlled that message? He was furious about it, and of course the whole thing was to undercut unions. He now does not have work as a union man, but there's a lot of work being done. But it's being done not by outsourcing, as he can see, but this is his perspective and from what he hears, so I'm not saying that it's the whole truth, but that the jobs that he used to do and his fellow union workers used to do are now being done by Central Americans who have been brought up by the corporations, who no longer have to worry about the unions, can pay very low wages, and there isn't work for him and his other unions. So I really think it has to do with the sneakiness of the message and how it's sent and how the counter message doesn't get out enough.
Yeah. You know, I mean, things are better than they used to be in so many ways. I mean, there was a time in this country when there were opponents to government's efforts to keep children younger than 10 years old from working in factories. There was really a battle in New York State once over whether or not government should prevent children less than 10 years old from working in a factory. So we have made some progress, but we've still got some ways to go, in my judgment. Thank you for those comments, by the way. Are there, yes?
Yeah. If I'm not mistaken, I guess Ohio State was one of the states voting for the new president. And so, like, taking into consideration the poverty in Ohio, like, what promises were brought along with the campaign for poverty alleviation, and are they into action so far? Like, that contradicts what you were saying with the tax cut. So, what was there?
So are you asking me if people
Yeah, so like,
vote?
I'm asking what kind of promises were there making people vote
Well,
for the new president?
people vote for a variety of reasons. I think people don't always vote for what even they perceive to be in their economic interests, because there are other factors that enter into a decision to vote. There are social issues, there are cultural issues, there are religious issues, so I think it's difficult to say specifically that a person is voting against their own interests, because we have to consider what that person perceives to be their own interests, not what we think their own interest is. And so there are a lot of people who think maybe, guns are a big issue, for example, in this part of the state. And so that might be their number one priority. And so it's difficult to determine exactly why people vote for what policies, because we try to figure that out. I've tried to figure that out for many years, and not always successfully. Yeah, it's very difficult. Other questions? Yes.
What do you think the effect of private development corporations such as 3CDC in Cincinnati have on the effect of urban poor? You can often drive through like Ohio's major cities and their downtown areas, and they have a lot of new buildings, new development, redevelopment of old buildings, but there's still quite a problem with poverty in
the suburbs. And, yeah. Well, having been in a position in my life where I've had to make decisions about, for example, tax incentives to get a company to build or expand or locate in a certain area and so on. So you find yourself making those judgments based on a lot of factors. But I do, and I'm going to make some sports fans really unhappy here. But in one of my congressional races, I was running against an opponent who supported public tax dollars being used for one of the Cincinnati sports stadiums. And I opposed it. And one of my arguments was this: why should a struggling family in Meigs County have any portion of their taxes go to help build a stadium in Cincinnati where the tickets are so high they couldn't possibly afford to take their son or daughter to see a game. And so, you know, these decisions on the parts of government are not easy, because you have to balance what jobs may be created, what's good for the larger community, with decisions about how tax dollars are spent. And they don't always, many decisions in government are not clear-cut, this is right and this is wrong. But you've got to try to achieve some kind of reasonable balance and when those kind of decisions are made. But it is true, you can go to a city like Cincinnati and the downtown is gleaming and growing, and there's obviously a lot of wealth and business success and so on, and you go to some of the suburbs. That's certainly true in Cleveland, Ohio, for example, and in nearly every other major city. Yes, Dean.
One thing I thought I'd just throw out, because it seems apropos from this discussion, I think we hit on this very important issue, which is why did people from diverse backgrounds see their common cause? And why, in economic terms? Mm-hmm. Because that's what built the Democratic Party.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
Was responsible for a lot of the programs in the 30s that you referred to. And so in thinking about that, I just would make the comment that if you think about Southeast Ohio, this is the birthplace of the union movement. Mm-hmm. I don't know if any of you, I think, Kim, you've been out, right? Done some tours. I don't know if any students here have gone out to the little mining towns. Mm-hmm. And there you had people who did not see their commonality in terms of being of different European extraction, of African extraction, mm-hmm. all working in these mining communities, and yet somehow they saw this common cause. So I just would like to stimulate your curiosity as to how that happened in a very dangerous and challenging environment.
Yeah.
In terms of the way that the owners of those companies viewed the unionization, and yet they were able to overcome somehow their differences of identity. And I guess I'm really getting to, that's what I see now, is this disintegration of people seeing their common cause economically and seeing identity in different ways that are part of the political discussion. Yeah. So we have here in Southeast Ohio an interesting case study. We're looking at some of that, and I suspect where you grew up too.
Absolutely.
Governor Strickland, right?
Yeah.
So,
anyone want to speak to what the dean has just pointed out to us? Have an idea of how that may have happened?
Any other questions?
Can I just throw out a theory in answer to your question? I think people, if they perceive a common enemy or a common threat, they're more likely to come together and pull together and set aside a lot of those differences. And the common threat was, terrible working conditions. And I mean, I've got a plaque with script on it. I don't know if some of you younger people know what script is, but the coal companies paid their workers with not money, but with what they called script. And that script could be spent in the company store. And it could be used to pay housing that was owned by the company. And so workers were, Tennessee Ernie Ford's 16 tons, what do you get? Another day older and deeper in debt, because they just found themselves in debt to the company they were working for, and all their work went back basically to the company store or the company house or whatever. And so I think those conditions caused people to see that they needed to come together because they had a common enemy. And as you say, it was a dangerous time. I mean, there was, it was, people were brutally killed and so on as they
Okay.
fought for their rights.
Right, and I mean, the dynamic was, so here are these people working, and then when there was labor unrest, they would bring in another ethnic group. So it leads just to some of the commentary, oh, it's the Mexicans, it's the Chinese.
Yeah.
So the enemy, from a certain point of view, are those folks, as opposed
Yeah.
to the people who are writing the script.
Yeah, that's right. I don't know how much longer we have here, but there's a question over here. Well, can we have one more question? Did,
Unless one of the students had a question. I was just going to chime in on that conversation. Don't you think that part of our current president, the part of his being elected, was that he was able to effectively convince a lot of middle America that everyone else is the enemy? I mean, exactly what you're saying, that the reason that people were surprised on election day a couple of years back was because those of us in the middle class who have attended college and have fared pretty well throughout the economic downturn, that we were out of sync with folks who grew up like I grew up. I can tell you, I have 8 brothers and sisters, and 6 of them voted for Donald Trump. And they all are working class people who were convinced by, an effective campaign that everyone else was the enemy and we needed to protect America against that. And so I think you're spot on, but I think that was used against those of us who would rather have a more collective view of working together to make a better society. Just
I think Governor Strickland pointed out something that's very important in all of this, which is the flat income. So it doesn't matter what the words are, if you go decades without seeing a real income increase, how are you going to trust the political powers that be?
yeah.
What crazy person would say that makes sense? Yeah.
Yeah, I just think they identified the wrong enemy. But I think
Well,
I think your observation is correct, is a correct one.
Sam, go ahead.
Actually, I
Oh,
have
yes.
something to say about the first question that we had.
Sure.
You can't solve a lot of issues in politics.
Come on up here, because I want everybody to hear you.
Embarrass him totally.
No.
You ask a question
He's a great fella, and he's got a good question, but I want everybody to hear it.
I actually met Mr. Strickland on the Wealth and Poverty field trip to Appalachia, where we looked at the communities that were suffering from poverty. It's hard to solve a problem that you have in politics if money is in politics influencing politicians. And paid politicians don't want to be caught being paid. In fact, they would rather you support them being paid. They want you to be happy that they're being paid by, say, an organization like the NRA for a gun issue. But companies that would be paying for the technological advances would be putting money into that politics to make sure that they're the ones being heard up, at the top. So 3 issues probably to deal with, like really quickly, would be money in politics, college tuition, because people who go to universities get more informed, and then they want to make political choices. They want to keep going on, and they know what's going on also. They're not just stuck in their communities hearing local information. And also raise the minimum wage so that people can afford to go to college, in the first place. So while we try to work out what kind of college tuition plan we want to do for students to help us raise the standard of living across the entire United States, we have some way to help families. That's all I have.
I think there's a few good observations. Thank you. Getting money out of politics and raising the minimum wage. I'm going to say something here that I'm not sure is correct. But I read it, so obviously. It was on the internet, so obviously it's the truth. No. That if the minimum wage had increased proportional to the larger economy across time, that it would be somewhere in the vicinity of $20 an hour now. And if if at some point in our economy's history, we were able to tolerate that level of minimum wage compared to, the state of the economy, why can't we now? And but I mean, just think about how different this country would be if we had a $15 an hour minimum wage. People wouldn't be getting rich, but they wouldn't be standing on the street corner begging for money for food either. And
or looking for jobs.
yeah, or looking. So this just gets to. I think we need to wrap up here. Time-wise, do we?
Here is one student, second.
Oh, we have another student?
Yeah. First off, thanks for coming. I got to meet you at our economics of poverty class as well, and that was a wonderful lecture you gave on your history of growing up in Appalachia and everything. But as an international development student, what I'm really interested in is the ways in which not just the American dream, but the American system of government with democracy, and this kind of idea that you, I think, crystallized perfectly in if you're willing to work hard, you should be able to have health care, you should be able to meet your basic needs and have the hope for your future generations to be able to do the same. I work for Dr. Edmonds in the Center for International Studies, and she's big on everything is universal, everything's global. So in some ways, I see that not just as the American dream, but as, a dream of humanity, around the world. I think that's something that everyone would hope for. So what I'm kind of interested in is the possibility of that kind of transplant working around the world and where you kind of see the current progress globally of, this idea of the American dream.
Well, I'm a patriotic American. I'm very proud of my country. But there are other countries that are doing a better job in some of these areas that we associate with the American dream than we are. I mean, there are countries where there is universal health care. And there are countries where there is access to higher education. I went to Cuba a couple of years ago. And Cuba is a repressive, authoritarian government. But you can get an education in Cuba. And if you get sick, you can get health care in Cuba. And so, and housing.
Housing, transportation.
Wages are extremely, extremely low, by the way. But I do think that the aspirations that I tried to articulate regarding just having a decent life. After I left the governor's office, I was offered a position which I didn't take with the International Labor Organization, headquartered in Geneva, Switzerland. And I went over there and spent some time with the ILO. It's older than the UN. It's an affiliate of the UN, but it was really established after World War I. And they talk about decent work. They use that word, decent work. And all work should be decent work. And it should result in adequate compensation that you can have a decent life. And I do think that's an aspiration to people probably all over the world. And different governmental policies can more or less encourage, what I call the American dream. And just let me say that I'm not sure right now that our country's in a very positive position to be a role model for that. We shouldn't be preaching to other countries as long as we ourselves are not addressing some of the problems we have internally, in my judgment. So, thank you for your statement.